1881. What a year to live in the Wild West. Welcome in, guys, to Nava County. This right here is the first episode of something that might turn out to be really cool, and the next iteration of a series very similar to Autumndale. You're about to watch me build the first city, or I guess town, or maybe village within this county. I had an absolute blast making this. As a matter of fact, I sat down to start building this and I looked up at the clock and it had already been like 12 hours. We're gonna tell a little bit of a story along with this build. And I'm also gonna tell you about some of the frustrations and difficulties that I have with it and that I'm going to have with it. But for right now, let's just enjoy this awesome build. Alright, so this town, or I guess village, is 100% inspired by and basically modeled after the little town of Valentine, which is in the video game Red Dead Redemption 2. Not only did I just think of the game for inspiration, I actually had the game up on my second monitor while I was building the city, walking around the town in the game and looking at the way that the city was designed and developed. And I really try to model and not necessarily copy, but get it pretty much just like it is in the game. And you're gonna see that even some of the buildings within this little town are actually assets that were created from Red Dead Redemption 2. Boomtowns. According to the dictionary, a boomtown is a town undergoing rapid growth and sudden prosperity. And what is this prosperity? Gold and silver. Gold and silver mining started becoming rapid in the American Southwest in the mid-17th century. And news of this potential prosperity was spread fast throughout the country. And people from all over started heading west to find their fortune. Mining camps started popping up all over the Southwest, which brought the need for other businesses such as trading posts, saloons, and banks. In most cases, these towns started with a tent so that the businesses could move easily if the location was a bust. But if the area struck gold, then they would make more permanent structures out of wood and adobe brick. In a lot of cases, people would follow the rail west. Whenever they would come to an area that had a water source, they would hop off the train and start their little settlement. And this is the case for Nava County. On his way out west, a young man named Charlie Martin saw a small river from the window of the train. He knew that this was the place where he wanted to get off and go search for gold. And luckily for him, that small river was loaded. He quickly sent a letter back east to his family and friends to come and help him, that soon they would be the richest men in the Wild West. Now, it wasn't long before they had themselves a little tent village, full of supplies and a chuck wagon loaded with food. Now, word spread fast about the gold in Nava County. And before you knew it, this little settlement had its own train station. Now, Nava County was named after the local Indian tribe that live on the edge of the county, near the hills. They were forced to relocate here by President Jackson back in 1830 from the Indian Removal Act. So far, no one's had any issues with them. There's only been a few encounters with the native Indians, and it was mostly peaceful. Fortunately, so far, Charles and his friends and family who settled this area were prospering, and their new life in this newfound land was exactly what they wanted. Towns like these that would pop up in the Southwest and throughout the West in general would heavily rely on the rail that was passing through. It would often drop off supplies so that these little settlements out in the middle of the desert could survive. Before any major businesses would pop up, you often would see small farms to hold cattle, sheep, pig, and other livestock. And of course, horses were the most valuable asset in the Wild West. In most towns in the Southwest, the buildings were strictly built from adobe brick because there weren't a lot of trees to get wood to build buildings from. However, in areas like this in the Southwest that did have trees, you bet they used them. But with wood came fire, so they had to be extra careful that they didn't spill an oil lamp or somehow let it catch fire. Even though there was some green in the area, it was still very dry, and these old wooden buildings were definitely prone to fire. Now, Indians and fires, that's not all they had to worry about out here in the Wild West. You always had to watch out for cowboys. But don't worry, we're gonna get to that later. Well, it didn't take long for the folks in this newfound settlement to lay down some barns, and with all their new riches, they purchased some livestock. They also set up a new tent village just on the edge of their new little town. But don't you worry, because this was only the beginning. It seems like any and every Western movie or TV series that you watch, the very first scene, or at least the very first thing that the main character does when he walks into the new little town is he goes straight to the saloon and he walks through those double doors, and then everyone just turns and then looks. But in reality, outside of drinking, gambling, and fighting, these saloons served another purpose. The word saloon comes from the French word salon, which in modern English just translates to living room. But in those times, it really meant an area or a place where people would come and gather. In a lot of cases, the saloon within the town would actually host several different things that you could get done in it, such as a makeshift or temporary courthouse, restaurants, and even a barbershop. And of course, it was a place where cowboys could spend their money for, let's just say, extracurricular activities. Oftentimes, saloon owners would open up the floor during the night for travelers passing through to sleep on the floor for a small charge. Even to this day, you can still find saloons throughout the country that originated in the 1800s. And my idea with this series is, if I keep it going, to show the evolution of these little towns throughout this county throughout the years all the way up until modern time. And so I'm definitely going to keep some of these areas and buildings that will last all the way until the modern era. After many years of prospecting, Mr. Martin finally thought it was time for him to settle down. With all his riches and gold, he built the first ever saloon here in Nava County. Here he would spend the rest of his days drinking and dancing. Along with that, many other businesses started opening up through town, like the Saints Hotel, which gave a place to stay for people passing through on their way to California. And across the street,
opened up a general store where you could buy yourself some liquor or tobacco. And of course, one saloon wasn't enough, so they built another. Now with all this business and prospecting, folks needed a place to keep their money. So Nava County got itself a bank. And right at the end of Main Street, there was a stable where you could either board your horse, or if you needed one, they always had prime horses for sale. Now, there was a godly man who lived out near the border of the county. He was tired of seeing all this riffraff come through town and wasting their days away at the local saloons. They were turning the locals to sin, so he decided he would build himself a church right at the top of the hill overlooking Main Street. And last but not least, he got the county sheriff's office. See, Nava County had a bit of a reputation. It seemed to attract the wanted man, bandits, robbers, and cowboys alike. It came to be known as one of the most dangerous places in the Wild West.
Now, as we progress through the time lapses in the building of this entire build, you're going to start to see some of the frustrations and struggles that I had. Basically, with a Wild West town like this, I'm working, or you are, or whoever is building a town like this, is working with very limited assets within the Steam Workshop. There just isn't a lot out there. Now, the ones that are here, I mean, you can see they're really good. But in this build, I use every single Wild West building on the workshop, or at least the ones that I could find. Now, why is this a problem? I was able to build the whole town and it looks great. Well, yes, but I want this to be a county. I want this to be a huge map where I'm building these little western towns all over, and I'm using the train to transport goods. I want to start putting in different mines and different, industrial things that you would see back in those eras. And I want to transport goods like logs via the train. The problem is that every single town that I make and the houses and residents that I make, they're gonna all be the same buildings. It's gonna look like I'm just copying and pasting it. So we have a few options. Number one, this can just be a standalone video and I kind of just leave it here, which I don't want to do for a couple of reasons. This is probably my favorite build that I've ever done in Cities Skylines, and I don't want it to end here. This reminds me quite a bit of Autumndale, and that was my favorite series that I've done so far, and I want to try to recreate something similar to that. So our second option would be to go ahead and leave this era, this time period right here, and jump into the future and start adding towns a little bit more into the future where we have more assets to work with. Or I can try to do some more late 1800s type towns, but they're not going to be as styled to the Southwest. They might be more East Coast style. And I don't know, I'm okay with that. I guess it would be really what the viewer wants to see. But ultimately, I do want to stretch out this map and I want to build several different towns. And I do want to go through the century, basically from this point all the way up until 2024. Skipping maybe 20 years or 30, 40 years, something like that. And watching these cities grow not only in size, but also throughout the decades and throughout history. Seeing the American history that was happening around it actually affect these little towns and cities. And ultimately, when we get to the modern era, you're going to see a much bigger town and city. And you're going to see that these towns all connect via a highway system. So just let me know what you guys think about all of this. Let me know if you think that this is a good idea or a bad idea, or maybe if you have a better idea, just let me know. If you do enjoy this series and you're an asset creator and you want to make some buildings for me, that would also be really cool. But the chances of that happening are probably pretty low. So if you're just a viewer, probably don't plan on that happening. I've also considered throughout making this to hire someone to build the assets for me, which I could do. However, it's going to get very expensive very fast. And I'm still not even monetized on YouTube, so this little passion project that I have, this hobby, is going to get very expensive, and I just don't think I'm ready to make that step yet. For a minute, I also considered building a bunch of buildings and assets. I probably could do it, but the time that it would take me would not match the time that I want to build this series. Also, I am just too busy to focus on that. Asset making is not my forte. So again, just let me know in the comments what you guys want to see, and I'll try to make it happen. Now going back to the build, one thing that I did before starting this project was go into the Steam Workshop and look for any and every single asset that I could think of. Again, I went running around through the town of Valentine in Red Dead Redemption 2, and I just looked at every little prop and small detail here and there throughout the town. And I would go onto the Steam Workshop and look to see if there was something that was similar to it that I could subscribe to and put into this map. So as I'm detailing it up, I am just scrolling through all the props and decals, putting them throughout the build in different locations where I think they would look good. And I know a lot of people struggle with detailing, but it's just a matter of having a lot to work with and trial and error. Grab something and put it somewhere and see if it looks good. If it doesn't, remove it. If it does, leave it. And always have something to reference from. That's one thing I always do with pretty much all my builds. Now, in the town of Valentine in Red Dead Redemption 2, it's pretty green. As a matter of fact, I think it's somewhere set a little bit further east than this build. Actually, hold on, let me check. Yeah, so from what I see online, Valentine was heavily based on a real life place called Valentine that's set in Nebraska. However, in game, it's much closer to snow-capped mountains, which in real life, that's not true. But nonetheless, it's pretty green. So I tried to incorporate that with a look that would make sense for a Wild West desert. And this is basically what I came up with. Vegetation is crucial to realistic builds. It's almost a necessity to use plenty of vegetation basically everywhere. And there's no like rhyme or reason or necessarily some trick to make it look right. It's just making sure that you have enough variety spread throughout. And you really just kind of have to find the ratio of how much to use. Like, you don't want to use too much or too little. And to be honest, I don't always get it perfect. I actually rarely do, but I do try to get pretty close. But if I took away basically all of the vegetation, it would not look super great. So yeah, vegetation is super important. It's also one of the most taxing things on your computer. So if you do try to detail like this, make sure you have a pretty good CPU so that you're able to do it. Another thing that you see here is the rocks. Rocks are very similar to vegetation, where they can really help the aesthetic of your build. If you go outside, and I don't really think it matters where you live, you're gonna see stone and earth pretty much everywhere. And even in areas where it's not super prominent, it definitely helps fill in some space and it creates that sense of realism, especially within this game. One method that I really like to use in most of my builds with rocks is to make them into procedural objects and just kind of blend them together with the earth. And I guess while I'm giving all these recommendations, just the last thing that I always recommend is use decals. A lot of times in City Skylines, two edges that are different colors, when they come together, it's really harsh. And you can use decals to help blend them together, like this muddy road and then the earth beside it. And then another thing is decals, they just really give that sense of realism, and I think that it makes builds look so much better. So here, I'm just adding more props and decals and vegetation behind the sheriff's office, and I'm going to fill up this entire row with more assets and props and decals. As I was doing research on old western towns, I did come to the realization that a lot of things that you see, especially in video games in Hollywood, is just that. It's Hollywood. Sometimes what you see in movies and games doesn't match what reality was. Now, we know that the buildings are pretty accurate because we still have towns today like Dodge City, Kansas, Tombstone, Arizona, and Cody, Wyoming. But I did learn that walking down the street, you wouldn't see a lot of the things that I've placed here in this build. Now, what I did do is fill it up and make it look like, you know, a movie set or Red Dead Redemption. But in real life, you wouldn't see empty boxes and wooden crates, wagon wheels, and barrels. I read that that would basically be the equivalent today of us leaving trash outside of our house. However, what they did instead was put merchandise right outside so that people would see as they're walking down the street. It was basically like free advertising. However, they weren't rusty or old, they were new because they were selling it. Also, during this time, they made sure to keep things looking nice. They would often sweep the boardwalks out in front of the stores, and if paint started to chip, they would repaint it. If wood started to rot, they would replace it. Now, I know when we watch movies, it's not always necessarily like that, but it's to give it that aesthetic, and it looks good. And I have to admit, even here in Cities Skylines, it does look pretty good. So before I start getting comments and feedback on this episode, I do probably want to go ahead and start on the next episode. So I was thinking I'm probably going to make something kind of like Saint Denis, which is another part of the map of Red Dead Redemption. I'll show you an example. It's kind of that older style city, which I think would look really good. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to fit it into the story, but I'm sure I'll think of something. I do know that it is more styled off of, I believe, like the American South, or maybe not the South, but like Louisiana and New Orleans, which I guess is still part of the South, but I'm from Georgia, so it's kind of definitely like a different culture. So maybe it doesn't exactly meet the American Southwest theme, but that's okay. I still need to look on the Steam Workshop to see if there's enough assets that I could do something like that. There probably is. It just might not be set in 1880, but maybe more like 1920 or 1910. But I know it has like the trams and stuff, so I think that would be cool. I probably wouldn't be able to do it like in one full episode like I did with this, and even this was kind of hard to put into one whole episode because there's a lot of footage and a lot of detailing. That is one thing that I made sure to do in this video that I haven't done in, I guess, some of my other videos like Autumndale, and that is to basically record everything that I do. The big issue was I didn't have a lot of space on my computer, but I bought an external hard drive that's able to fit a whole bunch more storage, so I'm not so concerned about recording every little thing. Just leaving the record button on and just go. But that being said, I have a lot of footage and not a lot to talk about, so I'm probably just gonna leave you guys for the last bit of this video is just the rest of the time lapse of me going around detailing the little town and adding more, you know, finishing touches. You could probably sit here all day and just continue adding little bits here and there, and eventually you kind of have to stop. Oh, and before I finished out the video, I did want to ask, I guess, one more question here. I tried putting in these old Western power lines, which at the time, I don't believe there was electricity, but they might be like telegram wires where I guess they could like send, you know, brief messages, or I'm not exactly sure how it works. I'd probably have to look it up. But the only reason I even thought to do it was when you look at Red Dead Redemption2, the little town of Valentine, they have them. And I believe the game was actually set in like the 1890s, so maybe a decade later, but I don't know how they look within the build. I think they kind of stand out a little bit too much, and they are kind of tall, so I might would need some different ones. But let me know what you think. I took them out in the end product. Oh, and one other funny thing that I did want to throw in here before I close out is I added a whole bunch of different types of horse and carriage assets, not assets, but I guess cars and transportation vehicles. And I took out all like the modern ones. So this is kind of like a behind the scenes, right, of me bringing in the vehicles into the map, which this little town that I built, I need to like give you guys an overhead glimpse of it, but it's basically right in the middle of the map. So they had to travel a really long ways. And traffic was like backing up a lot because they're very slow. Some of them are slower than others, and I just thought it was hilarious looking coming down the highway like this. But anyway, yeah, I'm gonna leave you guys with the rest of the time lapse and footage of this build. And I wanted to say one more time that I really did appreciate you guys watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.